As he prepares to leave office, President Biden is scheduled to make two major speeches to the American people outlining his executive and legislative accomplishments. And prominent MAGA Republicans are stupidly and dishonestly mocking this, asking questions like, what is Biden's actual legacy? Even though you and I both know damn well that the moment Trump is inaugurated, MAGA and Trump will start to take credit for Biden's accomplishments, even as a devastating New York Times report proves that Trump is inheriting a much better economy from Biden than Biden ever inherited from Trump. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, one of the many frustrating things about the outcome of the 2024 election is that once again, Donald Trump will inherit a good economy on a silver platter, and he will take credit for those economic achievements, and at least half the country will automatically, cultishly give it to him, give him the accomplishments, give him the credit, and then the rest of us will struggle to fact check. Mainstream media will be very lazy about this, and quite frankly, I expect even Democratic politicians will be woefully inadequate in pushing back on the MAGA framing. And all this will potentially do is make it easier for J.D. Vance, the current vice president-elect, to run for president in 2028. We have to fight the MAGA framing. So I want to talk about this a bit. So Eric Daugherty, who is a prominent MAGA Republican, on Twitter said, just in, President Biden to deliver two major speeches before leaving office this month to outline his legacy, according to NBC. What is Biden's actual legacy? This prompted me to respond like this. A bunch of shit you MAGA losers will gleefully take credit for the moment Trump's inaugurated, including infrastructure, $35 insulin, a $2,000 cap on out-of-pocket expenses for Medicare related to prescription drugs, low unemployment, a manufacturing boom, and Medicare drug price negotiation, because the first tranche of 10 prescription drugs, not just 10, the first tranche of 10, there will be more because of a deal that President Biden and the Democrats made called the Inflation Reduction Act that no Republican voted for. Medicare drug prices will be negotiated down, but the first tranche are scheduled to go into effect this year. So Trump's going to come in and take the credit, and Eric Daugherty and other MAGA Republicans will not only not correct Trump and by saying, actually, no, Mr. President, that wasn't you. That was the guy that we actually mocked. They will aid and abet and signal boost these lies. And we actually see, I'm actually going to skip to the end a bit because it's so frustrating. We actually see this already in terms of perception on the economy. Ian Bremmer pointed this out days after the election. Good news. The economy is great again for Americans that thought it was horrible a week ago. And you see this staggering shift, right? So when Republicans, partisan perception, we'll talk about this a bit more. Partisan perception in the economy is something that affects both parties, but Republicans are just objectively, demonstrably worse on this. The skew is much greater. You see how it is relatively tight among Democrats in terms of perception, with the biggest gap being 2020 during, the COVID-related economic catastrophe. You see a huge shift with the Republicans. Everything's great when a Republican's in charge. It's so great when a Republican's in charge and it's a total disaster. But then when a Democrat's in charge and we start to recover, it's even worse than the disaster under Republicans. Oh, but we're starting to see it spike up once Trump's elected. He's not even in power yet, just after he's elected. Others as well. Alex Stapp, consumer sentiment numbers by party affiliation have already inverted. And again, not that it's not there for Democrats, but it is much demonstrably more prevalent for the Republicans. So we see this, that their perception of the economy is skewed by who is in power. And again, we're going to get into some specifics, including a devastating New York Times article proving that Trump is lying about the economy, and what he's inheriting would be the envy of any U.S. president. So the Washington Post discussed this. The line charts, the article showed the 3-week average of responses in YouGov's polling. This was post-election in terms of the economic perception, and I think it was Philip Bump who published this article. This was even evident in responses from members of Biden's own party, a constituency with a reason to paint the economy in rosier terms. There was a spike in Democrats saying the economy had grown worse when the coronavirus pandemic emerged in 2020, and another when prices climbed during the Biden administration. Slowly, their views grew more positive. The pattern among Republicans, though, was much sharper. During the Trump administration, Republicans were much more likely to say their economic positions had improved, and under Biden, far more likely to say it had worsened. Since 2022, more than half of Republicans have said their economic situations have declined over the past year. But suddenly, over the past month, that's shifted. You can see it at the very far right of the graph above. That downward shift in worse off financially and the upward shift in about the same. Among Democrats, views of how they fare now relative to a year ago haven't changed much in the past month. Among Republicans, though, there's been a 16-point drop in the percentage saying that they were doing worse a year ago. Is that because something happened in early November 2023 that changed the economic status of Republicans? Haha, no. It is unquestionably because in early November 2024, Donald Trump won the election. We saw a similar shift in 2016. When Trump won that year, the views of the Republicans again improved quickly. In late November 2016, they were 13 points less likely to say their economic position had worsened over the year prior than when they had been in late October. It has consistently been the case that Republicans have more extreme views of the change of the overall state of their own finances than Democrats or Americans overall. So let's be very clear about this. Republicans are infinitely more likely to view perceptions of their perceptions on the economy to change relative to who's in power. Much more likely. And before we get to that New York Times article, I want to play you some clips of just earlier today of prominent Democrats, Adam Schiff and Chuck Schumer, talking about how Democrats lost the narrative on the economy, even though their economic performance and their economic legislation was just objectively good.
Before Missoula, Montana, Bloomington, Indiana. The bill lowering the cost of prescription drugs. As of January 1st, 10 of the most popular prescription drugs will be greatly lowered because we finally allowed, under our leadership, the drug companies, we forced them to negotiate with Medicare. So we did a lot of good things, but all too often, Kristen, we talked about the mechanics of the legislation and the details of the legislation, and we really didn't show the kind of empathy and concern to average, or show enough of it to average working families who didn't realize how much we had done and how much we care for them. So what we're going to do is spend a lot of time talking to working families, showing them how much we care about them, and not just talk about legislation, but talk about the conditions that have made so many working families worried about them.
And he should do that. Narratives are more persuasive than facts and figures. You know, Ben Shapiro coined the phrase, "Facts don't care about your feelings, gang," even though he represents a movement which emphasizes feelings far more than facts. Facts are much more likely to be on the Democratic side of the aisle than the Republican side of the aisle. But feelings are ultimately what win elections. And you can have all the facts in the world, but facts don't speak for themselves. You have to parlay those facts into a persuasive narrative. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party just sucks at this compared to Republicans, even though you would think they would have a much more sturdy foundation, given that the facts are much more likely to be on their side. I think we have an attitude in this party. We're starting to see a change, especially with these younger Democratic elected officials like AOC, Jasmine Crockett, Jared Moskowitz, Dan Goldman, Maxwell Frost, and even older politicians like Jamie Raskin and Bernie Sanders. Some people grasp this, but I think with President Biden, and he's admitted to this, right? He publicly said this just a couple of weeks ago during a speech. I think it was to Bloomberg, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe it was the Brookings Institute, excuse me. He admitted, he's like, I learned something from Donald Trump. Put your damn name on the checks. It didn't occur to Joe Biden to put his name on stimulus checks the way that Trump did, because Trump was crass and Biden didn't want to be crass. And it's crass to try to personalize government stimulus. But this is the age of politics where that's effective politics. And unfortunately, even though the president has been a very effective domestic president, when it comes to politicking, he just hasn't caught up with the times. The Democratic Party has to do it. Another clip from Adam Schiff before we get into the New York Times article.
I know I'm going to have to face very early on these tax cuts for rich people and for large corporations. What the voters in California elected me to do was to try to bring down the cost of living, the cost of housing, the cost of childcare, not to give tax breaks to very wealthy people or corporations. So my focus is on the economy. To your question earlier about James Carville, I think James Carville was right. I think it is still about the economy. I think we lost the argument on the economy. We need to win that argument. We need to persuade the American people once again that we are focused first and foremost on delivering for them, and that.
Yes, you do. And again, it should be easy defending President Biden's record. That's the other thing. We talked about this in a separate article a few weeks ago, that Democrats especially since they won't be in power, they need to double down on Biden's domestic record because it is the least neoliberal record on domestic politics that we've seen in decades. And if you want to incentivize a further departure from neoliberalism, you have to defend what was already there. You don't say that's enough. You don't say, okay, therefore we can just shake our hands and be done with it. Say, no, this is objectively good. We are going to defend it. President Biden's record was good. And then start to reshape the narrative. That's the only way you're going to incentivize future presidential candidates moving in that direction, is if you defend the progress that's already been made. And facts don't speak for themselves. So if you want to win elections, tell persuasive narratives using the facts at your disposal. So let us get to the New York Times article. Trump sees the U.S. as a disaster. The numbers tell a different story. President Biden is bequeathing his successor a nation that by many measures is in good shape, even if voters remain unconvinced. To hear Trump tell it, he's about to take over a nation ravaged by crisis, a desolate hellscape of crime, chaos, and economic hardship. Our country is a disaster, a laughingstock all over the world, he declared on social media last week. But by many metrics, many traditional metrics, the America that Trump will inherit from President Biden when he takes the oath for a second time 2 weeks from Monday is actually in better shape than what was bequeathed to any newly elected president since George W. Bush came into office in 2001. And who bequeathed President Bush that economy? President Clinton, a Democrat. It is a fact that modern economic history in the United States are Democrats presiding over objectively good economies, passing them off to Republicans, and Republicans tanking those economies in 1 or 2 terms. That is a fact. I digress. For the first time since that transition 24 years ago, there will be no American troops at war overseas on Inauguration Day. New data reported from the last few days indicate murders are way down. Illegal immigration at the southern border has fallen even before where it was when Trump left office, and roaring stock markets finished their best 2 years in a quarter century. I'll say it again. The stock market performed their best 2 years in a quarter century. Now, some people will say, well, not all Americans own stocks. Yeah, but Republicans boast about the stock market every damn chance they get. So why aren't they doing backflips and cheerleading over President Biden's stock market? That's the point. I'm not asking you to be hyped about the stock market. I'm saying if you're hyped about the stock market when Republicans are in power and the stock market does well, you have a moral and intellectual obligation to be honest and do it when Democrats do it too. Otherwise, you're a hypocritical loser and you should be made fun of. Jobs are up, wages are rising, and the economy is growing as fast as it did during Trump's presidency. Unemployment is as low as it was just before the COVID-19 pandemic and near its historic best. As a matter of fact, it went for the largest stretch at 4% or under President Biden since like 1960. Unemployment has been better under Biden than Trump. That's a fact. Domestic energy production is higher than it's ever been, including under Trump. The manufacturing sector has more jobs than any president since George W. Bush, which includes Trump. Drug overdose deaths have fallen for the first time in years. Even inflation, the scourge of the Biden presidency, has returned closer to normal, although prices remain higher than they were 4 years ago. Quote, Trump is inheriting an economy that is about as good as it ever gets, says Mark Sandy, chief economist of Moody's Analytics. The U.S. economy is the envy of the rest of the world, as it is the only significant economy that is growing more quickly post-pandemic than pre-pandemic, meaning better than it was under Trump's peak. Those positive trends were not enough to swing a sour electorate behind Vice President Harris in the November election, reflecting a substantial gap between what statistics say and what ordinary Americans appear to feel about the state of the country. And the United States clearly faces some major challenges that will confront Trump as he retakes power. And it goes on to address some of these challenges. And it goes on to discuss the divisions, the internal divisions among the American electorate and the American people. Indeed, many Americans do not perceive the country to be doing as well as the data suggests, either because they do not see it in their own lives, they do not trust the statistics, or they accept the dystopian view promoted by Trump and amplified by a fragmented choose-your-own news media and online ecosphere. Only 19% of Americans were satisfied with the direction of the country in Gallup polling last month. Another Gallup survey in September, 52% of Americans said they and their own family were worse off than 4 years ago, a higher proportion than felt that way in presidential election years of 1984, 1992, 2004, 2012, or 2020. Think about it. More than half of Americans say that they're better off now, or they're worse off now than they were at the height of COVID, which is insane. It's just insane. I'm not saying that there are not credible reasons for Americans to be upset about the current economy. Prices are too high. But consider the economic shutdowns, unemployment staggering, not being able to get toilet paper, grocery shelves being empty due to Trump's mismanagement of COVID. And yet we have just memory hold all that. It was in Trump's political interest, of course, to encourage that sentiment and appeal to it during last year's campaign. He was hardly the first challenger to emphasize the negative to defeat an incumbent president. So it's just, it keeps going like this. 15 minutes in, so I don't want to read the entire thing. But Trump is moving back into the White House with an enviable hand to play, one that other presidents would dearly have loved on their opening day. President Reagan inherited double-digit inflation and an unemployment rate twice as high as today. President Barack Obama inherited 2 foreign wars and an epic financial crisis. President Biden inherited a devastating pandemic and the resulting economic turmoil. Quote, Trump is stepping into an improving situation. William Antholis, director of the University of Virginia's Miller Center, which has studied presidential transitions, said of Donald Trump. Antholis compared the situation to President Clinton's arrival in 1993 when he took over a growing economy and a new post-Cold War order. While the country had already begun recovering from recession during the 1992 election, many voters did not yet feel it and punish President George W. Bush. So it goes on like this. Of course, not everyone is enjoying good economic times, as many low-middle-income households are struggling financially, and the nation has mounting fiscal challenges. But taking the economy in its totality, it rarely performs better than it is now while Donald Trump takes office. Andrew Bates, a White House spokesman, says that the latest reports demonstrated that President Biden's policies are working and argued that Republicans should not seek to repeal them once they take control of the presidency in both houses of Congress. Quote, after inheriting an economy in free fall and skyrocketing violent crime, President Biden is proud to hand his successor the best performing economy on earth, the lowest violent crime rates in over 50 years, and the lowest border crossings in over 4 years. And then it goes on to complain, Carolyn Levitt, spokesperson for Donald Trump, she, of course, lives in an alternate reality. Americans delivered an overwhelming election day rebuke of the Biden-Harris administration's abysmal track record. Communities being overrun with millions of unvetted migrants who walked over Biden's open border, lower real wages, and declining trust in increasingly politicized law enforcement agencies that are unable to even publish accurate crime data. Is the crime data perfect? No. Have there been revisions? Yes, but those revisions are happening in public. If the crime data were being suppressed by politicized law enforcement, they would never revise the crime data. You moron. You see how their own notions, their own conspiracies fall apart? It's interesting. Trump does not have to share a positive view of the situation to benefit from it. When he takes office on January 20th, absent the unexpected, he will not face the sort of major immediate action forcing crisis that, say, President Obama did in needing to rescue the economy from the brink of another Great Depression. He will have more latitude to pursue favored policies like mass deportation of undocumented immigrants or tariffs on foreign imported goods. And if past his prologue, he may eventually begin extolling the state of the economy to claim successes for his policies. He is even already taking credit for recent increases in stock prices even before assuming office. He has demonstrated a skill for self-promotion that eluded President Biden, enabling him to persuade many Americans that the economy during his first term was even better than it actually was. So, we go on like this. It's definitely an article that is worth your time. But the bottom line is that this is one of the many frustrating components, folks. It really is. Modern American history is not that Democrats have been perfect. They're not. Democratic presidencies are not perfect. But by and large, pound for pound, they are better than Republican presidencies. And we've just seen this really sinister leapfrog. A Democrat manages the economy in the country relatively well, hands the situation off to a Republican. The Republican mismanages it. The next Democrat has to clean up the mess, but it's not done perfectly or quickly enough, which means that the recovered economy is handed off by the American electorate to another Republican who does the same damn thing, and on and on and on we go. The very people right now who are saying, Biden doesn't have a legacy really to boast of, I promise you, they will be the same people who not only won't fact-check Trump when he does take credit for President Biden's infrastructure projects, President Biden capping insulin at $35 for Medicare and Medicaid, capping $2,000 on out-of-pocket drug costs for Medicare recipients, this low unemployment, this manufacturing boom as a consequence of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Chips and Science Act, Medicare drug price negotiation, I promise you, they will not only not fact check Trump and say, no, Trump, come on, we love you, guy, but you can't take credit for this. They will gleefully aid and abet it. And mainstream media will not do a damn thing about it. And again, unfortunately, I am skeptical that even elected Democrats will shout this truth loudly enough. I expect that Democrats will unfortunately do what they are so often do when it comes to messaging, which is get exhausted, roll over, and try to win the next fight. And as long as we do that, we will constantly lose ground to right-wing MAGA framing. It has to stop, and I hope Democrats and the media take this election cycle and this Trump presidency to do just that. In the meantime, let me know what you think in the comments.